Good morning. My name is Grant Oliphant, and I'm privileged to serve as president and CEO of the Pittsburgh Foundation. I've always hated these videos when people start off by explaining why they can't be with a group that they really should be with, and that's certainly how I feel this morning, but I do have a legitimate excuse. This is what comes of debating hockey with Ian Bird. Although that was, I have to point out to Ian, that was when things were going a little better for the Penguins. So I'm just probably not going to bring that up with him anytime soon, or he'll send me a care package. My talk this morning is going to be about innovation in the community foundation field. And what I'm going to try and do very quickly in this video is share a few thoughts that I was going to share with you in person. Because I think that our field is at a critical moment. And the conversation that you and I and everybody in the room there with you needs to be a part of is the conversation about what's next in our field. For the last few years, our field has been engaged in an increasingly vigorous debate between two schools of thought. There's one group that can be best characterized, I think, by this sentiment. And this group thinks that our field is doing perfectly fine and can continue to operate business as usual. And then there's a decidedly different school of thought, which has been emerging of late, that our field is in serious trouble and faces dire challenges, and in fact might be at risk of being broken. And the model by which we operate itself might be broken. I think at a minimum we have to acknowledge as a field that this second group's school of thought deserves attention. I'm going to argue against buying into it entirely, but the point underlying it, that we face serious challenges and need to face up to them, is very real. As it's been made by others, including Emmett Carson at Silicon Valley, the argument goes like this: we're not built from a revenue model standpoint to withstand serious periods of economic downturn and volatility such as we faced in recent years. We're up against competitors who are able to outcompete us on price and indeed are reducing the price of some of the services and products that we offer down to almost zero. And then we're operating in this radically changing world where concepts of community and what constitutes philanthropy are changing dramatically before us. And so the argument is that in the context like this, some of us as a field are dying already and more are going to die. Now, I think that we can acknowledge the sobriety of those challenges and the gravity of the moment we're in without necessarily buying into the idea that the field itself is broken. And that's what I want to suggest to you this morning. I firmly view this as an innovation challenge for our field, not a search for a silver bullet solution, not a fix-it problem, but rather a call to experiment and innovate our way forward. Now, as this debate has been going on for the last couple of years, typically it has centered on how we pay for ourselves as a field. It's focused essentially on the revenue or financial model. And this is the model that answers the sustainability question. How do we stay in business as institutions? But as I've spoken with community foundation leaders all across North America in recent years, the constant refrain that comes back to me is that that's not really the issue that leaders in our field are focused on. What they see, it's an important question, they get it, but they see it as part of a bigger challenge. It's a question of delivering on their purpose as institutions. And that is a different question from a revenue model question. It's a business model question. If the revenue model focuses on how to keep the doors open, a business model looks at the larger issue of why that matters. As Michael Porter from Harvard might put it, it asks, what is our unique role in the value chain? Now, if we're being honest with ourselves, no question brings out the Jekyll and Hyde personality split in our field faster than this one. For our communities, we inevitably state our value in terms of community impact and change. But for our donors, at least if you look at our single largest product offering, the Donor Advised Fund, we state that value in terms of their priorities and their discretion. Now, I'll leave it up to you to decide which personality is which. In this slide here, no judgment, it's kind of a Rorschach test. Now, that tension between these halves of our personality is perfectly captured in the CF Insight study that was recently done on donor-advised funds. That study found that there is very little alignment, and indeed very little attempt at alignment between foundation priorities and donor priorities. We can rationalize the two halves of our personality if we think of this middle area, this end, this overlap, as being large. But what does it mean to our field when not only isn't it large, but apparently we're not even trying to make it larger? About a year ago, a man named Neil Alexander, the dad in this photo, came to meet with me, literally right before I walked into that meeting. And this just about knocked me flat. I was at my desk working on a TEDx talk about what our society can learn from people who are facing impossible countdowns. Neil, it turned out, had just been diagnosed with ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease. He was facing the worst of countdowns. And the reason he was there is he wanted the end of his life to be about helping others, and he wanted to do it through us because that way his legacy would be woven into the community he loved. Now, I know there are several hundred of you in the room today, and any one of you could easily tell a dozen such stories from your own work and your own organizations, but here's why I tell this one. What I learned from studying the example of people like Neil, people who face terrible countdowns with amazing courage, is how many of them triumph in a way by reacting with what I came to call fierce acceptance. The ingredients of fierce acceptance are simple. These people focus on the reality at hand. They get very serious about time and what Martin Luther King called the fierce urgency of now. They reframe their situation around what's still possible, and then they do that thing, and they do it now. They act. I wonder what it would look like if we were to apply this concept of fierce acceptance to this moment in our history as a field. I think the first thing we would acknowledge is that we are in a period of what Clayton Christensen at Harvard calls disruptive innovation. Commercial competitors, new technology, social media, price wars, shifting community loyalties. Let's face it, all of these are challenging us, not because we're broken, but because that's the world we're living in. And the question becomes, how do we respond to that? I think if we acknowledge that simple reality, we would stop standing at the intersection of fear and doubt, waiting for someone else to save us with a quick fix or the perfect report. And just remember, if you don't think that's what's been going on in our field, it has been 7 years since On the Brink predicted challenges to our existing business model and value proposition. So maybe it's time, folks, that we stop being shocked by the fact that there are challenges to our existing business model and value proposition. Organizations that emerge successfully from periods of disruption are the ones that advanced the reframing and action stages of fierce acceptance. For us, the question isn't what do we think is wrong with us and what's the cure, what's the fix? The question is, how do we evolve to keep adding value in a changing world? There's no easy answer to that question, but that's okay. In a changing environment, the point is not to have a perfect crystal ball. It is to make educated guesses and to experiment. Now, this is very different, by the way, from succumbing to the temptation that one of our colleagues has called chasing the shiny object. This is the temptation to always go after the latest fad or the latest new technology and to see in that the magic solution to whatever worries we may have. You always see this with organizations, and I've seen it with some of our own organizations, where we think, you know, the latest technology or maybe the newest app will give us a solution to making us relevant in our communities. And the reality is that that gets it backward. Technology needs to come after and serve purpose. Purpose needs to be first. The question isn't what's the app for that, but what's the purpose of the app? Now, I want to lighten up on us for a moment because I think it's important to acknowledge that as I look at how institutions in my community are facing similar challenges and how nonprofits across the United States are facing it and associations are facing it, I'm reminded of what the scholar of mythology Joseph Campbell observed about the hero's journey, which is that this is how the journey of transformation always begins. It always begins with the hero desperately casting about for a way to get out of having to take the trip. And we're kind of in that phase at the moment. But eventually, in any good story of transformation, the hero always wakes up to the essential truth so perfectly stated here. And I love this idea. There is crisis in the world, and there is the matter of going forward. So your reality is the world's in crisis, the world's in change, and now the question is, how do we deal with it? Unfortunately for us, and for the hero in our own story, there are some ways that we can do that. As some of us in this field have begun wrestling with it, one of the things that we discovered very quickly is that other people were thinking about it as well. And one of them was Gabriel Kaspar at the Monitor Group, now Deloitte, who was looking at the same question of what's happening around innovation in community philanthropy. And as we began talking as a field, what we realized is there's a lot of great experimentation and innovation happening in our field. It's happening in Vancouver, it's happening in Chicago, it's happening in Charlotte. You can look at multiple places across North America, and it's happening, and indeed it's beginning to happen globally. And there are a lot of new models for how community foundations deliver value. What there isn't is a systematic way of trying to capture all of that wisdom, nor is there a systematic way of looking at what else is happening in community philanthropy or in philanthropy generally that affects what we do. So the question is, how do we get serious about innovation? And what we struck upon is the need not for another report, but for a design process using a concept called design thinking that draws our entire field and even people from outside of our field into a conversation about the best practices that are happening out there, the best ideas for moving philanthropy forward, the best ideas for delivering on our purpose. And looking at our business model not as one thing, not as revenue and how we bring revenue in, but seeing revenue as part of the entire value chain and looking at our business model holistically. Everything from revenue, because it's important, but also the networks we're a part of, the structure that we have, the processes that we use, the products that we offer, and ultimately and most importantly, what we are in the communities that we serve and what we are delivering around our purpose. The goal of the process, this notion of what's next in philanthropy, is not to come up with a silver bullet or a cure or a single perfect business model. Let's give up on that idea. Rather, the idea is let's engage as a field in looking at multiple possible solutions. Let's create a more engaged and dynamic field. Let's develop a higher capacity as a group to adapt. Let's design our own future. So here's what I want to leave you with. And I hope that there'll be a robust discussion about this up there in Winnipeg that I'm sorry I'll be missing. We as a field are challenged. There are multiple influences that we're seeking to deal with in our environment. That does not make us broken. It requires our attention, and it requires us to think systematically about how we're going to innovate our way forward. And that's the challenge for all of you in the room today. That's the challenge for our field, to get serious about innovation as a field. One of the people I considered when I was performing my research on people who have faced impossible countdowns was a Carnegie Mellon professor named Randy Pausch. Randy became famous for the last lecture that he delivered right before dying from pancreatic cancer. And what he said in that last lecture, one of the sentiments he expressed, and that he later expressed in the book by the same name, was the idea that when obstacles are put in front of us, they're not put there to keep us from getting where we need to go. They're put there to see how badly we want to get there. And here's the question I have for our field. I think one of the things that has always set community foundations apart is that our model for growth is not just growth. It's not just revenue. Our model for growth is about impact. It's about making a difference in the communities we serve and about making a difference in the world that we're a part of. Being a unique meeting place for individuals of means and individuals who are in need, for communities that are dealing with things on a very local level, and a world that is going through dramatic changes. We're a unique bridge for that. And the question for us as a field is how badly we want to be that bridge. How badly do we want to continue to be about a unique model of growing by being relevant in the world and delivering an impact on a local level the way no other community institution can. I believe it's a great model for the future. We just have to keep inventing it. We are stewards of an amazing trust that's been handed down to us by previous generations and that is being entrusted to us still today by present generations, and that we hope will continue well into the future. And the challenge for us as institutions and the challenge for us as leaders is to live up to that stewardship challenge and deliver on that unique and remarkable purpose that has been given to us. Thank you, and I wish you well. And Ian, go Pens.